The last thing any writer wants is for someone to think we aren't original or that we're just recycling commonly used phrases and ideas, right? So how do you avoid recycling other people's writing, whether it's a plot premise or a turn of phrase? How do you avoid hack topics and cliches? Today, I'm going to share 3 strategies to make sure you're leaning into your own originality. Let's go. Whenever I hear a writing rule, I ask, why? I am very skeptical of writing rules because for years I was tyrannized by them. And turns out most writing rules I think are nonsense, or at least they need caveats. Show, don't tell, for example. I have so many issues with that, and I spent so many years hearing it. I talk about this all the time in my writing program. But that's not for today's episode. Today's episode is about avoiding hack ideas and cliches. So yes, whenever I hear a writing rule, I ask myself, why? What's the reason behind this rule? Well, a hack idea I think of as a literary trope, just something that's overdone. And a cliche is an overused phrase, like, she fell head over heels in love, or he couldn't believe his eyes, or it went in one ear and out the other. The reason not to use cliches and literary tropes or hack ideas is that when we hear something over and over, it loses its power. And for most creative writing, the whole point of writing is for the reader to feel something transformative. It's also a little bit lazy for us to do as writers. It's sort of like outsourcing your one job, which is to write. Like if you were hired to make someone a cake, and instead of making them a cake, you just gave them a cake someone else had baked. All of this said, we tell the same stories over and over again. I've heard it said that there are really only 7 stories, and every possible variation on that is just that, it's a variation. So what's the difference between telling a kind of archetypal story and being unoriginal or tropey? And how do you avoid cliches? Key number 1 is actually write. And I don't mean to be too sassy with this one, but I do mean to be a little sassy. Remember the analogy I made about the person hired to bake the cake? You don't want to be her, right? You know what cliches are. A cliche is something you have heard over and over again, like once upon a time, or happily ever after, or he stopped dead in his tracks. You know when you hear these phrases that you didn't invent them. These did not come out of your brain. So when you catch yourself relying on one of them, just tell yourself to do it differently. Be original. And listen, we all use cliches sometimes. I'm just saying that when you catch yourself, swap them out. And if you genuinely aren't sure if something is a cliche or if you thought of it, then it's probably not. And if it is, at some point, someone's going to point it out to you. So I wouldn't worry about it for now. Just remember, you're a writer, and a writer finds ways of describing something that isn't just a repeat of the same thing everyone else says. Again, the reason we do this is because we want the reader to experience the story we're telling. In trying to figure out what the right detail is to use, you can ask, what does this actually feel or smell or taste like to me? If you're not living it, close your eyes and try to remember it. 1 or 2 really good details, I think, beat 20 mediocre ones any day. I tell writers this all the time. Just a couple of really great details can do the work of a dozen mediocre ones. There's an exception to this tip to avoid cliches, and that exception is dialogue. Dialogue, of course, consists of words spoken by your characters themselves. And for dialogue, our primary rule is, would this character say this? If the answer is yes, this is exactly how this character speaks, then fine. If a character speaks in cliches, the cliches can go in. But you just need to be sure to ask, would this character speak this way? Because not everyone speaks in cliches. Most of us actually don't, but some people do. And it can be kind of funny. I have a friend who speaks in cliches a lot. He doesn't realize he's doing it, saying things like, she means the world to me. But I find it very endearing. Outside of dialogue, you don't want the narrative writing that you are doing as the writer to have very many or any cliches. Key tip number 2 is to be specific. The uniqueness of your story lies in its specificity. Specific details that you invent or share from your own life, if you're writing nonfiction, can never be cliché because they truly did come out of your lived experience or out of your brain. If someone else happens to come up with a similar expression, who cares? It'll feel different because yours is yours. As long as there are enough specifics, it won't come across as hack or cliché. Every few months, a writer in my program will come to me in a panic and say, Mary, I'm having an emergency. I found out that someone else is publishing a novel with a premise that's almost just like mine. Or they'll say, oh, someone is publishing a memoir and she is basically me. And I calm them down by reminding them that there's no identical story. Even if the premises are the same, the execution is going to be different. It can actually also be a good sign if someone has sold a book like yours to a publisher, because it means that there's a market for it. All right, I have one more strategy for you, but before I share it, I just want to invite you to apply to my program, The Book Incubator. The link is down below this video. It's only 2 questions, it takes less than 5 minutes. And if you're writing a book, you'll definitely want to check it out. Okay, now back to the video. Key tip number 3 is to bring your heart to it. You showing up emotionally as the writer is what makes it feel true. And true things never seem hackneyed or cliché. They're real, and it feels like a real person lived them. By showing up emotionally, I mean that you feel something as you write. And yes, I even mean this if you are writing fiction. I tell writers that I work with all the time, I want them to be feeling something every maybe 2 to 3 days that they sit down to write. And I know that may sound weird, but what I'm trying to say is that you don't have to be feeling something every single time you write. Sometimes we just have to get words down. We have to make it through a transitional scene. We have to describe a lake house or a Ferris wheel or an SUV. But at least 1/4 or maybe 1/3 of the time, we want to be feeling something. I don't mean it has to make you cry. You don't have to be sitting there, sobbing. You don't have to be seething. You don't even have to be a little bit teary. But you also don't want to feel like you're doing your taxes or like making a spreadsheet. I mean, that's too emotionally removed. When we feel something as we write, it's much more likely that the reader is going to be feeling something as they read. When I was working on my first novel, When You Read This, which it's the one that I rewrote about 10 times over 6 years before someone finally told me this, it was an editor who finally said, you know what? This writing is really strong. She actually said that, but she said it lacks heart. And if you don't write with heart, your story isn't gonna find readers. I was truly floored by this advice, but as soon as I read it in this letter she had sent to me, I also knew that it was right. It was a life-changing piece of advice because from then on, I gave myself permission to write with heart, and it changed everything for me. All right, speaking of writers I work with, are you writing a book or do you want to write a book? Because if so, I would love to hear from you. When I'm not writing, my mission in life is to help writers write their dream books. I love it. I live for it. Before I published my novels, I first had to figure out how to write one. And it wasn't easy because none of the writing classes I was taking had showed me how to actually write a novel. It wasn't until I had a newborn baby, actually, and very little time to write that I came up with a real process. And the process worked. I wrote my entire novel during my 8-week maternity leave. Now I teach this process in my program, The Book Incubator, and it works for dozens of other writers. If you're curious to know more, I have a free video walking you through this process for writing a book, and you can get it by clicking below and answering just 2 questions to apply to the program. You get the video whether you join or not. There's no pressure to enroll. Just click below to tell me a little bit about you and your book. It's just a form you fill out online. I'm so excited to hear from you.